Did your family walk on eggshells or explode without warning?
I never imagined that the night of my engagement dinner, the moment that was supposed to finally feel like mine, would become the clearest reminder of just how invisible I had always been in my own family. The room was full of laughter and conversation, people clinking glasses, my fiancé squeezing my hand under the table with that small reassuring gesture he always gives me when he knows I am about to unravel, and for a second I thought maybe, just maybe, this time they would see me for who I really am. But then Dad leaned back in his chair, smirk tugging at his lips like he had been rehearsing it for days, and with a voice loud enough for the whole table to hear, he said, "Your brother's the one we're truly proud of." The words didn't just cut through the evening, they cut through years of pretending I was part of the same family, and all I could do was sit there in silence, while the sound of my own heartbeat seemed louder than the clinking glasses around us. It wasn't even just what he said, it was how he said it, like he was delivering the punchline to some cruel joke that everyone was supposed to nod along to. And the thing is, most of them did, because they all knew the family narrative, the same one that had been carved into every holiday dinner and birthday party for as long as I can remember. My brother was the golden boy, the one destined for greatness. And I was just filler. I wanted to say something, to challenge him right then, but the years of swallowing my pride had built a reflex stronger than my anger, and so I bit my tongue so hard it almost hurt more than his words. But then, and this is the part that changed everything, my coworker Sarah, who had come as a guest because she has become a close friend, leaned forward with that confused look people get when they're not sure if they're missing a joke or if they've just stumbled into something uncomfortable, and she said, almost casually, "Funny, he just got fired from my company yesterday." The table went dead silent, like someone had ripped the air out of the room. I looked at my father, and for the first time in my life, I saw his confidence falter. The smirk vanished so quickly it was almost comical, but I didn't laugh, not then. I just sat there and watched him squirm while the illusion he had worked so hard to polish began to crack right in front of everyone. My brother, who had been basking in the usual glow of undeserved praise, started fumbling for words, his face tightening as though maybe if he denied it strongly enough, it would erase what Sarah had said. He tried to spin it immediately, muttering something about downsizing and choosing to move on, but Sarah wasn't done. She clarified, clearly and firmly, that he had been terminated for misconduct, and suddenly the spotlight he had always loved was burning him instead of lighting him up. My mother reached for Dad's arm like she always does when things get tense, trying to steady him, but even she couldn't smooth over the awkwardness that had settled like a weight over the entire evening. And me? I sat perfectly still, quiet, holding back the storm that wanted to explode, because for once, silence was power. I realized in that moment that nothing I could have said would have been more effective than letting the truth speak for itself. My father had chosen to humiliate me on the night of my own celebration, to remind me in front of everyone that I was second best, and yet it wasn't me who had to defend myself, it was him. The pride he had weaponized turned instantly into shame, and I felt something shift inside me, something I hadn't felt in years, control. The rest of the dinner went on in an awkward haze. People tried to move the conversation along, to pretend like nothing seismic had just occurred, but the tension never left the table. My fiancé kept giving me those small squeezes under the table, and I knew he was proud of me for not breaking down, for not giving them the satisfaction of seeing me rattled. My brother tried to recover by telling exaggerated stories about his past achievements, but nobody was buying it anymore, not after Sarah's blunt revelation. And my father, well, he avoided my eyes for the rest of the night, which in our family was the closest thing I had ever received to an apology. When the evening finally ended and people filtered out, hugging us and congratulating us with voices that felt strained and polite, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: that night had changed everything. I didn't need to shout, I didn't need to beg for validation, and I didn't need to defend myself against their constant dismissals anymore. The truth had slipped out on its own, delivered at the perfect time, and it was only the beginning. Because sitting in that chair, watching my father's smugness evaporate in front of a room full of witnesses, I realized something that should have been obvious all along. I didn't have to prove myself to them. I had the power to let their own lies collapse under their weight, and I wasn't going to stop there. That was the night I decided I was done playing the forgotten daughter, done waiting for scraps of approval, and done letting them control how my story was told. That was the night I started planning. When people hear that line my father delivered at my engagement dinner, they often assume it must have been some rare slip, an uncharacteristic moment of carelessness where he accidentally said out loud what he truly thought. But the truth is that it was simply the latest in a long chain of moments that had defined my entire life, because growing up in that house meant living with the constant reminder that no matter what I achieved, no matter how hard I worked, no matter how much I tried to earn even the smallest acknowledgement, I would always be measured against my brother, and I would always come up short, at least in their eyes. From the time we were children, it was clear that he was going to be the one they poured everything into, while I was expected to keep quiet, keep the peace, and stay out of the way. I can still remember being in middle school, bringing home a report card with straight A's, the kind that most parents would proudly hang on the fridge and brag about to anyone who would listen, but instead of congratulations or even a nod of approval, my father asked, almost dismissively, if I had checked in on how my brother was doing with his baseball practice, because that's what really matters right now. The irony is that my brother never cared about baseball at all. He went through the motions because they pushed him into it, while I quietly folded my report card back into my backpack, feeling stupid for even thinking it would matter. Those small moments stack up, and eventually they stop feeling like isolated disappointments and start to become your reality. When I think back on my teenage years, what stands out isn't the milestones I should have been proud of, the scholarships, the awards, the leadership roles, but the way each one was minimized in subtle but deliberate ways. If I came home with good news, the conversation somehow shifted back to whatever my brother was doing, even if it was something trivial like buying a new video game or getting invited to a party. I would sit there, listening to my parents light up with pride at the most inconsequential details of his life, while I tried to remind myself that my accomplishments meant something even if they refused to see it. Eventually, I stopped telling them much of anything, because why give people the opportunity to ignore you when you could just keep it to yourself and avoid the sting altogether? But the hardest part wasn't just the lack of recognition, it was the way they expected me to sacrifice without ever acknowledging it. When money was tight, it was always me who had to make adjustments. I remember one summer when I wanted to attend a writing camp that my teacher had personally recommended because she believed I had real potential, but my parents told me it was too expensive and that maybe next year we could make it work. Weeks later, my brother decided he wanted a new car, and somehow the money magically appeared, with my parents proudly calling it an investment in his future. I sat in my room that night, listening to him rev the engine of that car in the driveway, and I understood that their definition of investment never included me. The funny thing is that for years, I convinced myself that if I just kept my head down and worked hard, eventually they would have no choice but to acknowledge me. I thought success was undeniable, that if I piled up enough evidence of my worth, it would break through their bias. But it never did. Even when I bought my first home entirely on my own, something they never thought I could do, the only comment my father made was that it was nice, but not as big as the one your brother's aiming for. It was like no matter how far I pulled ahead in reality, in their eyes I was still trailing behind the image they had built of him. And what makes it worse, what makes the bitterness stick even now, is that my brother knew it. He knew he was their favorite, and he leaned into it, playing the role of the golden child even when he didn't earn it, enjoying the benefits of being carried while I was left to build myself from scratch. I don't blame him entirely. Who wouldn't take advantage of being put on a pedestal, but the resentment I felt was less about him and more about the system our parents created, the one where his failures were framed as learning experiences, while mine were treated as confirmation that I was not good enough. By the time I reached adulthood, I had stopped expecting fairness, and I had stopped waiting for my parents to notice me, but what I hadn't stopped was that quiet longing for something different. For one moment where they might actually say they were proud of me without tacking on a comparison or a caveat. That longing is what made my father's words at the engagement dinner sting so deeply, not because I hadn't heard the sentiment before, but because it proved that even in the moment that should have belonged to me, even with a room full of witnesses, he could not resist reminding me that I was always second place. And yet, as painful as those years were, as suffocating as it felt to grow up in the shadow of a brother who had been handed opportunities one could only dream of, it was also those very years that hardened me, that taught me to rely on myself, and that gave me the resilience I needed to stand there at that dinner table and not crumble when the same old pattern played out yet again. What he didn't realize that night, what none of them realized, was that those years of being pushed aside had turned me into someone they could no longer control, and the silence I chose was not weakness, it was the beginning of my plan. By the time I reached my late 20s, after years of silently enduring the constant comparisons and the endless dismissal of anything I achieved, I had begun to understand that the only way to survive was not to wait for the recognition that was never going to come, but to quietly build a life that was mine, untouchable and undeniable, even if my family refused to see it. At work, for the first time in my life, I found a space where effort translated directly into respect, where long hours and difficult projects turned into promotions and leadership opportunities, and where people saw me not as someone's daughter or someone's sister, but as someone who could actually get things done and get them done well. It was a strange adjustment at first, because I had been trained my whole life to expect that success would be met with indifference or brushed aside, but when my manager looked me in the eye and told me I had earned a promotion, there was no backhanded comparison, no subtle reminder that my brother was the real star. There was just acknowledgement, clear and simple, and that acknowledgement became the fuel I needed to keep pushing forward. Meanwhile, my parents remained entirely uninterested in my work, rarely asking what I was doing or how things were going, except to casually slip in a question about whether my brother might benefit from an introduction or a connection I had made. It was almost amusing in its predictability, because no matter how many times I explained that he was in trouble at work, that he was burning bridges faster than he could build them, they still clung to the image they had created of him as some brilliant prodigy destined for greatness. In the past, I might have wasted my energy arguing, trying to convince them with facts and evidence, but by then I had grown wiser, and I learned that letting them underestimate me was not a burden but a tool. Every time they dismissed my achievements or failed to recognize the stability and independence I had built, they unknowingly gave me more room to maneuver, because when people assume you are powerless, they never notice the moves you are making until it is far too late. My fiancé understood this better than anyone, and his support became the anchor I had never experienced in my own home. He reminded me, often in small and quiet ways, that the life we were building together was real, that it mattered, and that it did not need the approval of anyone who had chosen not to see it. My closest friends, people like Sarah who had witnessed the humiliation at the engagement dinner, reinforced that belief by treating me as someone worthy of respect, someone whose voice carried weight, someone whose success was not only valid but impressive. For the first time, I began to realize that family was not defined by blood, but by who actually shows up for you, who celebrates you without hesitation, and who doesn't require you to shrink so that someone else can shine. At the same time, I started to set boundaries that I never would have dared to set before. I stopped answering every call, stopped rearranging my schedule to accommodate last-minute demands, and stopped volunteering information about my personal life that would only be twisted into another opportunity to elevate my brother. It was not a loud rebellion. There were no dramatic confrontations or tear-filled speeches, but it was effective because for the first time my parents were forced to realize that their access to me was no longer guaranteed. They still tried, of course, to insert themselves into moments they thought they could control, but I had already begun to make it clear, through action rather than words, that I was no longer the desperate daughter begging for approval. And all the while, I kept climbing at work, kept proving myself in spaces they knew nothing about, until one day I realized that my position, my income, and my network of connections had placed me in a stronger, more stable place than my brother had ever been, despite all the advantages he had been given. That realization did not come with bitterness, though there was plenty of it to be had. It came with clarity. I no longer needed their validation to measure my worth. What I needed was patience, the kind of patience that allows someone to wait for the perfect moment to reveal just how wrong the people around them have been all along. So when my father humiliated me at the engagement dinner and Sarah delivered the truth about my brother's firing, I did not see it as a single humiliating incident or even a moment of vindication. I saw it as the culmination of years of underestimation, years of dismissal, and years of quietly building the power they never thought I would have. Because what my parents and my brother never understood, and what I had only just begun to fully grasp, was that the silence they mistook for weakness had actually been preparation. I was no longer the child waiting for a pat on the head, and I was no longer the young woman hoping that one more achievement might finally be enough. I had already built the foundation of a life they could not diminish, and now I was ready to use it, not just to protect myself, but to finally tip the scales in my favor. The only thing left was to decide when and how to let them see just how much power I had been holding all along. When the dust from the engagement dinner began to settle, I knew my brother would try to spin the story in his favor, because that was always his way, and true to form, within days he was telling anyone who would listen that he had not been fired but had chosen to leave his job to pursue better opportunities, as though the entire embarrassing scene at the dinner had never happened. My parents, of course, clung to this new version of events like a lifeline, repeating it with straight faces as if saying it often enough would make it true, because they could not bear the thought of their golden son being seen as flawed, irresponsible, or anything less than the shining example they had always insisted he was. In the past, I might have seethed in silence while they polished his lies into something resembling truth, but now I saw it for what it really was, an opportunity. And I decided it was time to stop watching from the sidelines and start nudging the narrative in the direction it deserved to go. The first step was subtle, almost imperceptible, because I did not need dramatic confrontations or screaming matches to get my point across. Instead, I began to let small truths slip into conversations, never as accusations, but as casual observations that could not be easily dismissed. At a family gathering not long after the dinner, my brother started boasting about leaving his old job on his own terms, and while my parents nodded along proudly, I simply asked, in a measured tone, if he had resolved the HR issue that had been brought up before he left. The look on his face, that fleeting flicker of panic, told me everything I needed to know, and though he quickly brushed it off, the damage had been done, because everyone at the table noticed the shift. I didn't need to, because when the truth is on your side, you only have to plant the seed once for people to start questioning the story they've been fed. At work, meanwhile, Sarah and a few other colleagues who had witnessed the whole dinner fiasco became unexpected allies, not because I asked them to intervene, but because word spreads, and once the truth about my brother's firing began to circulate, it became harder and harder for him to keep up the illusion. In professional circles, his name was now tied to carelessness and misconduct, while mine was tied to competence and reliability, and the contrast grew sharper every day. I never once had to raise my voice or publicly call him out. I simply allowed the truth to do the work, and it did so far more effectively than any outburst could have. My father noticed the shift, even if he refused to acknowledge it outright, because I began to see it in the way he avoided discussing my brother's career with the same unshakable confidence he once had, and in the way he grew quieter whenever I spoke about work or plans for the future. My mother still tried to smooth things over, repeating half-hearted excuses for my brother's failures, but even she seemed to be running out of ways to dress up the reality they had spent so many years hiding. For the first time, I could sense the cracks spreading through the perfect facade they had built around him, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it collapsed completely. The real turning point came during another family dinner, smaller and less formal than the engagement celebration, where my brother once again attempted to dominate the conversation with inflated stories about his so-called business ventures. I let him talk, let him build up his elaborate fantasy, and then, with the calmest voice I could muster, I asked him how he was planning to fund it given that his credit had been flagged after the termination. The silence that followed was deafening, and unlike before, no one rushed to cover for him. My parents sat frozen, My brother sputtered half-formed excuses, and I leaned back in my chair with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that for once, the truth had cornered him in a way no one could ignore. It wasn't cruelty that drove me in that moment, though some might see it that way. It was justice, plain and simple, because for years they had used every opportunity to belittle me while propping him up with lies. And I had finally found a way to turn the knife not through rage but through precision. My revenge was not loud, it was not violent, and it did not require me to destroy him. It required me only to let him destroy himself while I pointed, gently but firmly, to the evidence. As I left that dinner, walking away with my fiancé's hand in mine and my parents still sitting in stunned silence, I realized that the balance of power had shifted. My father could no longer control the story, my mother could no longer paper over the cracks, and my brother could no longer swagger without fear of being exposed. The golden image they had clung to was tarnished beyond repair, and though they might have hoped to rebuild it, I knew I had the leverage to stop them every time they tried. And that was when it truly dawned on me. Silence had been my weapon for years, but now truth was my ally, and with those two forces combined, I could dismantle their carefully constructed narrative piece by piece until nothing was left. What they had never understood was that their endless underestimation of me had been their greatest mistake, because it gave me the patience to wait, the wisdom to strike only when the moment was right, and the power to make every cut land exactly where it hurt the most. In the weeks that followed, something shifted in the atmosphere of my family. A subtle but undeniable change, because for the first time in my life, I was no longer the one who had to defend myself or explain my choices, and instead it was my parents and my brother who found themselves scrambling to hold together the crumbling facade they had spent decades presenting to the world. My brother, stripped of the professional respectability he had once flaunted so effortlessly, began weaving desperate stories about new opportunities and investors who were supposedly lining up to back his ideas. But it was obvious to anyone paying attention that he was spinning fantasies out of thin air, and the more he talked, the less convincing he became. My parents tried to cling to these narratives as if repeating them loudly enough might restore some sense of dignity, yet beneath their strained smiles and forced optimism I could see the cracks widening, and I realized they were not just worried about him, but terrified of what it meant for their own image, because if their golden son fell, then the story they had told about themselves as brilliant parents raising a future star would fall with him. It was in this fragile state that they finally came to me, not with the arrogance I had grown accustomed to but with voices softened by desperation, suddenly remembering to ask about my work, suddenly remembering to praise my choices, suddenly remembering that I was the one who had quietly built stability and success while their favored son unraveled. They spoke of family unity, of forgiveness, of the importance of standing together, and they tried to position themselves as loving parents who had simply been misunderstood. But every word rang hollow because it was not love that had brought them to my door. It was need. They needed me because I had what they no longer did: credibility, stability, and the respect of people who actually mattered. In the past, a younger version of myself might have leapt at the opportunity, might have mistaken their sudden interest for long-awaited recognition, might have allowed herself to be pulled back into the same cycle of sacrifice and dismissal. But I was no longer that girl. I listened to their pleas, nodded at their carefully chosen words, and then calmly reminded them that family is not defined by blood alone but by actions, by consistent presence, by the choice to lift someone up instead of cutting them down. I told them, without raising my voice, that the years of being dismissed could not be erased by a few desperate compliments, and that respect was not something they could demand when it suited them, but something they had chosen to withhold until it was too late. The real moment of reckoning, however, came at a public event, a charity gala my company had sponsored, where I was not just a guest, but a keynote speaker, standing before a room filled with colleagues, executives, and community leaders. My parents attended, uninvited but clearly eager to attach themselves to my success now that my brother's reputation was in ruins, and I could see the way they hovered on the edges of conversations, trying to remind people of their connection to me as if proximity could somehow restore their status. I took the stage that night, not to expose them directly, not to humiliate them as they had once humiliated me, but to make it unmistakably clear where my loyalty lay, with the people who had supported me, with the partner who stood by me, with the friends who had celebrated my wins even when my own family did not. I spoke about resilience, about the importance of building something steady when others doubt you, and though I never mentioned names, the message was obvious to everyone who had watched the way my life had unfolded. When I stepped down from the stage, the applause still ringing in my ears, I caught my father's expression in the crowd, and it was the first time I had ever seen him look small. The smirk he had worn so confidently at my engagement dinner was gone, replaced by the realization that the power he had always held over me had vanished, and in its place stood someone he could no longer control. Someone who had turned his years of dismissal into strength. My brother avoided me entirely that evening, too busy trying to convince strangers of his fabricated success, but no one was listening to him anymore, not when the contrast between us was so painfully clear. I did not gloat, I did not rub their faces in the truth, because I didn't need to. The victory was not in tearing them down directly, but in showing, without a shadow of doubt, that I had risen despite them, not because of them, and that their attempts to diminish me had only made my eventual triumph sharper and more undeniable. As the night ended, I walked past my parents without offering them a seat at my table, past my brother without indulging his empty words, and out into a future that was mine alone, no longer tethered to the chains of their favoritism. For the first time, I was not the forgotten daughter or the lesser child. I was the one holding all the cards, and the beauty of it was that I did not need to use them to punish anyone. Withholding them was punishment enough. They had wanted control, they had wanted access, they had wanted to bask in the glow of success they had never nurtured, and I had denied them all of it simply by standing firm in what I had built. That was the final blow, not a dramatic outburst or a cruel takedown, but the quiet, undeniable reality that I no longer needed them, and they had nothing left to take from me. And as I closed that chapter, I felt no guilt, no hesitation, only the deep, satisfying clarity that comes when you realize you have won, not by playing their game, but by walking away from it entirely and making sure they can never rewrite the story again.